What happens when a superpower runs out of soldiers? When its mighty army, once the symbol of fear and dominance, simply disappears into the mud of a losing war. Tonight, the Kremlin faces that nightmare. The Russian army, once boasting more than 1 million men, is collapsing under the weight of its own brutality. After 3 years of unrelenting warfare, the steel of Putin's military machine has rusted from within. Across the Donbass front, reports from Reuters and BBC describe ghost battalions units that exist only on paper. Russian drones circle empty trenches, searching for men who no longer come. The Kremlin is panicking. Casualties have surpassed 1 million, according to Western intelligence cited by DW. Moscow's once feared divisions have been replaced by convicts and mercenaries. Entire formations stormed Wagner remnants, burned away their replacements little more than desperate civilians pulled from factories and universities. The Kremlin's response: not reform, not retreat, desperation. In a secret plan exposed by Ukrainian intelligence and confirmed by Al Jazeera in October 2025, Putin has ordered the mobilization of 2 million reservists. It's the largest call-up since the Second World War, hidden under bureaucratic jargon, but aimed at refilling the army's empty ranks. The logic is cold quantity over quality. Every man between 18 and 55 becomes a potential soldier. But the problem isn't just numbers, it's morale. These aren't patriots rushing to defend their homeland. They are men who've seen the truth on social media, the burned out tanks, the endless funerals, the lies. Putin's war has lost its mythology. Even the most loyal citizens know what awaits them in Ukraine: death frost and silence. Strategically, this moment marks the end of Russia's conventional power. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly call it a structural military implosion. The Kremlin is now fighting with reserves of human life it cannot afford to lose. While the United States under President Trump reasserts global deterrence, deploying naval assets to the Mediterranean and Indo-Pacific, Russia is devouring itself. Globally, the parallels are clear. Ukraine's defense stands as a mirror to Israel's struggle against Iran's proxies, and to the US-China rivalry over Taiwan conflicts, where willpower collides with exhaustion, where technology outweighs manpower. Yet in Russia's case, there is no balance left, only depletion. And behind the front lines, a darker storm brews. 2 million Russian students, fathers, engineers are refusing to die for a lost empire. The Kremlin's order has ignited rebellion. Now the question echoes through Moscow's streets and deserted barracks: if Putin's army has melted away, how long before his power follows? Imagine a nation locking itself from within borders, sealed airports, frozen trains halted mid-route. No invasion, no foreign blockade, just fear. That is Russia tonight. A digital iron curtain now surrounds the world's largest country, trapping millions of men in what The Guardian calls a national-scale draft prison. The Kremlin's new order is merciless. Every Russian man of military age is forbidden from leaving. At checkpoints from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, FSB guards scan passports linked to a vast database known as Gosislugi, the government's e-draft system. Once a portal for taxes and healthcare, it now issues electronic summonses, digital shackles. The moment a man receives one, his ID is flagged. Airports deny boarding. Borders turn red. Escape becomes impossible. This is Putin's iron trap, a weapon more efficient than bullets. It doesn't kill, it captures. Sources from DW confirm that the Kremlin's border control software has been fully integrated with military draft lists since mid-October 2025. Within hours, the state can immobilize entire generations. Behind this curtain lies panic. Putin knows what happened in 2022, the Great Exodus. Over 260,000 men fled Russia in the first mobilization, according to Reuters, a humiliation that stripped the Kremlin of its myth of unity. This time, Putin intends no repeat. Every avenue of escape has been sealed. Strategically, the move reveals a regime cornered by its own failures. Analysts at Defense News note that Moscow's logistics core, already stretched to the breaking point, cannot absorb 2 million new recruits. The measure isn't about replenishment, it's about control. The Kremlin fears rebellion more than defeat. By locking in its men, it seeks to prevent a domestic collapse that could rival 1917's revolution. Yet this kind of digital lockdown carries global echoes. The same surveillance that now hunts Russians mirrors the technologies used in Iran's internal repression and even in China's social control grids. Where those regimes digitize obedience, Moscow digitizes fear. It's a fusion of 20th century tyranny and 21st century coding. In Ukraine, drones track targets. In Russia, algorithms track citizens. The front lines and home front have become one. And so the war no longer ends at the battlefield, it invades the private lives of millions. The borders of Russia have become borders of the mind, where the price of freedom is no longer measured in rubles, but in courage. The Kremlin calls it mobilization, but ask the young men deleting their social media, hiding in basements, burning SIM cards, does this feel like patriotism or imprisonment? How long can a nation survive when it must chain its own people to keep them from fleeing? For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin ruled not by love, but by a quiet deal. You stay out of politics. I keep your life stable. That was the unspoken social contract that kept the Kremlin untouchable. But now that pact, once sealed in oil profits and calm streets, has shattered under the roar of war. As BBC News and DW both highlight, the foundation of Putin's authority was never ideology, it was predictability. Russians traded freedom for comfort. They accepted censorship in exchange for stability. The chaos of the 1990s had scarred them deeply. Putin offered a simple bargain order, rising wages, national pride. For years it worked. Moscow's skyline glittered and people stopped asking questions. Then came February 24th, 2022, the day everything broke. The special military operation was sold as distant, bloodless, contained. The Kremlin promised that life in Moscow would remain untouched. But when the first wave of mobilization hit that September, the illusion died. The state began knocking on doors in apartment blocks and villages, demanding lives for its lies. By 2025, the same middle class that once ignored politics now faces the war at its doorstep. According to Al Jazeera, even urban professionals, the supposed beneficiaries of Putin's promise, are hiding from recruitment officers. Doctors forge medical exemptions, engineers quit their jobs to vanish into small towns, and teachers falsify records to protect their sons. The myth of stability has crumbled. Strategically, this collapse is more dangerous than any defeat on the battlefield. The Kremlin's power depended on social apathy, but as The Guardian noted in a recent editorial, when fear replaces indifference, control begins to fail. Every arrest, every border check, every funeral adds another crack in the regime's facade. Internationally, the pattern is familiar. When regimes push their people past the limit, Tehran in 2023, Beijing during its lockdowns, or even military juntas facing rebellion, the backlash always comes from within. Putin's Russia now mirrors the same trajectory from managed fear to uncontrolled anger. And beneath it all lies the erosion of identity. For years, Kremlin propaganda painted Russians as defenders of the motherland, heirs to victory over Nazism. But that narrative collapses when the state starts hunting its own citizens. There are no heroes in a war fought at gunpoint. Inside Russia, this realization is spreading like wildfire. University campuses buzz with whispered conversations about escape routes. Small businesses quietly relocate staff abroad. Even in loyal regions, priests and veterans speak of moral exhaustion. The Russian state once promised its people, "We won't touch you if you don't touch us." Today, that promise lies in ruins. The question now is no longer whether Russians support Putin's war, but whether they can survive their own government's fear of losing it. Factories silent, freight trains unmoving, offices half empty. This is the unseen front of Russia's war, the collapse not of armies, but of an economy strangled by fear. Economists from Reuters and DW describe it as a brain lockdown, a crisis where the nation's best minds and strongest workers vanish not through exile, but paralysis. When Putin sealed the borders, he didn't just trap potential soldiers, he imprisoned the economy. The 2 million men targeted for mobilization aren't just conscripts. They're the engineers who keep tank factories running, the IT experts who maintain digital infrastructure, the truck drivers who deliver ammunition to the front. By cutting them off from mobility, the Kremlin has frozen its own bloodstream. The Guardian warns that major Russian industries, Uralvagonzavod, Almazante, and Rostec subsidiaries are suffering catastrophic delays. Skilled laborers are disappearing, either drafted or in hiding. Production quotas for missiles, artillery shells, and drones have fallen by nearly 40% according to defense news estimates. Logistics systems are in chaos. The fear of mobilization now drives men to quit before the state can find them. In 2022, the crisis was a brain drain. Educated professionals fled to Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and the EU continuing remote work from abroad. But in 2025, escape is no longer possible. The economy is no longer bleeding, it's suffocating. This time it's a brain lockdown. People stay home, delete their records from state databases, and vanish into the gray zone of Russia's underground economy. The ripple effect is devastating. Tax revenue collapses as millions stop reporting income. Hospitals and schools lose male staff. Factories operate at half capacity. Truck convoys sit abandoned on frozen highways. Western sanctions continue to bite, but the deadliest blow is self-inflicted. Russia's own government has turned productivity into treason. Strategically, this is the regime's blind spot. As Jane's Defense Weekly points out, no modern military can survive without a functioning industrial base. Every drone strike, every missile launch depends on the labor of the very men Putin is now hunting. Even nuclear deterrence requires technicians, not prisoners. The global echoes are alarming. When economies implode under pressure, instability spreads. Israel's conflict with Iran's proxies has already rattled energy markets. China's naval assertiveness continues to disrupt trade routes. Now Russia's paralysis threatens global supply chains of oil, gas, and fertilizers, commodities the world still depends on. The West, while observing from a distance, cannot ignore the tremors of a superpower eating itself. Inside Russia, the human toll is silent but immense. Families live in constant dread. Fathers refuse to go to work for fear of being drafted. Sons vanish overnight. Wives queue outside government offices begging for news. What happens when a government forces millions to choose between survival and productivity? How long before fear stops being a deterrent and becomes a spark? The Kremlin once called it the Second Great Patriotic War, a grand narrative meant to echo 1941 when the Soviet people rose against fascism. But now, as BBC and DW report, that myth lies buried beneath the ruins of trust. If this truly were a patriotic war, why must Moscow imprison its own soldiers to make them fight? Across Russia, propaganda broadcasts continue images of parades, medals, and slogans like "For the Motherland." But the words sound hollow. Soldiers at the front record video pleas for help. Deserters speak of chaos, corruption, and starvation. Reports from Al Jazeera confirm more than 25,000 confirmed desertions within a single military region, with that number expected to triple by year's end. Commanders execute soldiers for refusing orders. Corpses of traitors are used as warnings. It's not unity, it's survival under duress. The so-called patriotic army has become a legion of hostages. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly compare the situation to the twilight of Tsarist Russia in 1917, when soldiers turned their guns on officers rather than enemies. History is repeating itself. Putin's iron trap has not created loyalty, it has manufactured resentment. Each new conscription order deepens the fracture between the state and its soldiers. Strategically, this is fatal. Modern warfare requires morale as much as firepower. Even advanced weapons, drones, hypersonic missiles, electronic warfare units cannot compensate for an army that no longer believes in its cause. The Kremlin's command now relies on threat surveillance and executions rather than discipline or purpose. It's a war machine built on fear, not conviction. Globally, the contrast is stark. Ukraine's soldiers fight to reclaim their homes. Israel battles Iran's militias under existential threat. America projects power across two oceans to maintain freedom of movement and deterrence. Russia alone fights its own people. As Defense News observes, this is no longer a foreign war, it is an internal siege. The facade of patriotism has collapsed, leaving only the raw machinery of coercion. And yet, this forced mobilization reveals something deeper: Putin's loss of faith in his own citizens. He no longer calls them defenders of Russia, he calls them resources. Disposable, replaceable, expendable. The myth of unity, once Russia's greatest weapon, has become its greatest lie. The Kremlin can still parade tanks through Red Square, but the soldiers inside those vehicles know the truth: they are prisoners on parade. How long can a regime survive when its army no longer fights for victory, but only to avoid execution? How long before obedience turns to open revolt? The streets of Moscow are quiet, but it's the silence before a storm. Beneath the surface, anger is boiling. The borders are locked, the internet censored, and millions of young Russians are trapped inside what The Guardian calls a nation-sized detention zone. The Kremlin believes it has contained rebellion. In reality, it has created it. Across Dagestan, Tatarstan, and the Urals, secret protests are spreading once again. Videos leak through encrypted channels, women blocking roads, shouting, "This is not our war," soldiers deserting with their weapons. Police refusing to carry out new draft orders. According to sources cited by Reuters, at least 70,000 troops have vanished from their posts since January 2025, a number not seen since the fall of the Soviet Union. Putin's so-called iron trap has backfired. By sealing the borders, he has turned Russia into a pressure cooker. Those who once fled are now forced to stay with nothing left to lose. Sociologists quoted by DW warn of a point of no return. When fear collapses, defiance replaces it. Every blocked exit fuels determination. Every arrest strengthens resolve. Strategically, this is where authoritarian control meets its breaking point. Intelligence analysts at Defense News describe it as the internal front collapse. When a government begins to view its citizens as enemies, its fall becomes inevitable. The Kremlin no longer trusts its people, and the people no longer believe the Kremlin's lies. The echoes across the world are hauntingly familiar. Iran's regime cracked under the weight of protests. China struggles with silent unrest over economic stagnation. Even Western democracies wrestle with the balance between control and freedom. But in Russia, the stakes are higher because the state wields nuclear power but has lost human power. President Donald Trump's administration now faces a world reshaped by internal implosions rather than invasions. American policymakers watch as Russia's collapse creates both danger and opportunity. A weakened Moscow may open new doors for diplomacy, but also new risks for instability. NATO intelligence networks warn that a cornered Kremlin could act unpredictably, using hybrid warfare to project chaos outward while losing control within. Inside Russia, the human cost grows unbearable. Families separated, sons, missing mothers detained for questioning the war. The same state that promised protection now hunts its own. Priests whisper of betrayal. Soldiers confess they no longer know who they're fighting for. The patriotic songs once played on state TV now sound like laments for a lost country. And so the ultimate question remains: what happens when a regime built on fear discovers that fear no longer works? The fuse has been lit, the digital border is cracking, the army is exhausted, the people are awakening. History teaches that no fortress can stand forever when it is built on the suffering of its own. When the walls of this digital prison finally fall, will they bury Putin's enemies or Putin himself? Russia stands on the edge of implosion. After 3 years of brutal war, the Kremlin's military machine has crumbled, forcing Vladimir Putin into a desperate secret mobilization of 2 million men. The digital Iron Curtain, now sealing Russia's borders, has transformed the nation into a vast open-air prison, trapping millions in fear. What began as a war against Ukraine has evolved into a war against Russia's own people. The collapse of Putin's social contract, once built on stability and silence, has unleashed a chain reaction of resistance, economic paralysis, and moral exhaustion. Factories idle, soldiers desert, families hide. The myth of the patriotic army has died. The Kremlin now commands through coercion alone. As rebellion simmers across Russia's regions, the regime's survival hangs by a thread. Western observers warn that this could be the beginning of a new Russian revolution, one not sparked by ideology, but by despair. How long can fear sustain a government that no longer inspires loyalty? And when the walls of Putin's iron trap finally shatter, who will rise from the ruins of a nation betrayed?